welcome all of you to this second webinar that we are doing on the future of the WTO or WTO of the future. Uh, I cordially welcome you all to this webinar. As some of you may recall, around 2 years ago, we ran a campaign on what would happen to a world without the WTO. We considered the costs of doing global trade in the absence of the predictability and stability provided by the WTO. Needless to say, such costs could be enormous and would turn the clock back on globalization and trade-led economic development. In our campaign, we emphasized the role of the WTO in bringing back order to a chaotic world and to buttress multilateralism. Enthused by the relative success of the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, we kicked off this new series on the future of the WTO last month. What we've done is, even in the last one and in this one, we're very happy to see that leading experts from around the world have come together with the aim of initiating a fresh conversation on the future of the WTO, or as we said, what should a WTO of the future look like? The first webinar touched upon various dimensions of the WTO's negotiating, monitoring, and dispute settlement functions. Panelists discussed the role of consensus decision-making, the growing divergences between the WTO and the FTAs, and the interaction of plurilateral negotiations within the multilateral trading system. The first webinar set the tone for further discussions on these crucial issues. Today, we pick up from where we left off the last time. The huge interest and welcome, Montek.
Hi.
The huge interest and enthusiastic participation in the last session, which was moderated by Montek, as well as the turnout today, is very encouraging. It speaks volumes of the great interest in global trade governance, not just among trade policy experts, but also among common people around the world. It also convinces us of the need to redouble our efforts to raise awareness about the importance of the WTO and the role of freer and fairer trade in raising living standards for the common man and woman, a thought echoed by Deborah Elms of the Asian Trade Center in the first webinar. Today, multilateralism itself is in peril. As Montek highlighted in our previous webinar, there is a need for greater high-level political engagement at the G7 and G20 in order to take forward the multilateral trade agenda. Next year, India is scheduled to host the G20, and we hope that this issue is taken up seriously there as well. In his farewell speech as the then WTO DG almost 20 years ago, on 31st July 2002, Mike Moore had said, "When I arrived in Geneva, the WTO was at a crossroads. Never before had the multilateral trading system enjoyed such prominence in international life, yet never before had it been so fiercely attacked." We're looking at 20 years ago. Never before had the fundamental principles of the system, consensus, non-discrimination, the rule of law, been so right and so necessary. Yet, never before had it been so hard to see them applied in practice. These words ring us true as in 2022 as it did 20 years ago. If there's one thing we can all agree upon is that MC12's relative success does not guarantee similar outcomes going forward. What will the future of the WTO look like, or will we need a new WTO of the future? We are privileged to have another top-notch panel with us today to discuss these issues. Let me welcome and thank Annabelle, Tim, Victor, Simon, Hamid, and Stephen for taking out time and joining us today. A special thanks to Montek, who has once again kindly agreed to moderate today's session. And let me also tell you what happened in the first webinar was Montek is a very prominent, renowned globally renowned economist, and has been a distinguished econocrat in India as well. And he has not dealt with trade particularly, so we thought it was an extremely important aspect of the factors like Ngozi that somebody comes without a trade background is able to look at things in a very fresh manner. With that, let me thank you once again to everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to a productive discussion. And to the audience, please type in your questions in the chat box so that they can be taken up in the Q&A session. I now hand over to Montek and request him to take forward today's session. Over to you, Montek.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pradeep. It's a great honor to be asked to moderate an important session like this twice. At least you have to conclude that you didn't muck it up the first time around. So thank you for inviting me. It's a subject I'm very interested in. And I don't want to speak at length about it, but to my mind, there's one thing that I want to draw attention to in what you said, and that is that there is a general consensus in favor of free and fair trade. But actually, the real problem today is that the definition of free trade very often conflicts sharply with the notion of fair trade. And this has always been the case, but I think in the present environment, increasingly, the major trading partners are raising questions that you cannot have free trade, you cannot have fair trade unless you have much deeper integration behind the border. I mean, this is an issue we touched upon earlier. And it's quite clear that this impacts developing countries' strategy. I mean, our position consistently has been that multilateral trade is very important, and India should support multilateral trade. But the problem is that if the global consensus now is to accept plurilateral trade, because multilaterally you cannot get the kind of deep integration agreements, then the issue is if you can't stop the multiplication of plurilateral agreements, what is the optimal approach that you should adopt? Looking narrowly at India's case, does it mean that we should simply say, look, since plurilateral trade is a second best and multilateral trade is best, we are not going to join any plurilateral trade arrangement. We're only going to sort of keep talking about liberalization multilaterally. If the objective circumstances are such that the prospects for that are very limited, then you have a choice. You either accept second best and join in some plurilateral arrangements and try to shape them in a manner that suits you best, or just stay outside and be marginalized. So that is really the hard choice that policymakers have to face. So with those, and I don't have the answer to this, my guess, by the way, is that it doesn't make sense to stay completely outside. But I'd like to be better informed on that as a result of the discussion. So without further ado, let me request Annabelle to kick off the ball. So Annabelle, can we have your views?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. First, to Pradeep for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to join such a distinguished panel of colleagues and friends. So I think you're right, Montek, that in a way, each ministerial conference takes a life of its own, and they all become unique in their own way. And in this case, I could highlight several factors that contributed to the successful outcomes we saw at MC12 on key issues, from the lingering pandemic and the growing food crisis to the health of our oceans and the digital transition. And let me highlight three factors. First, I thank the perseverance and grit of the Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was instrumental in steering ministers towards consensus. Second, ministers' pragmatism and willingness to compromise, which was in full display, for example, in the decision to take an incremental approach to deal with rules on fisheries subsidies. And third, I would highlight also the hands-on role of the Secretariat, myself and the DG included, in facilitating members reaching agreement on the most controversial issue of intellectual property well before the ministerial gathering started and then throughout. Now, regarding next steps, let me underscore that we have a huge agenda going forward and very little time before the next ministerial conference due to take place before the end of 2023. So we really need to roll up our sleeves and get back to work very quickly. Now, a big part of our work going forward will focus on implementing the outcomes from the ministerial. And here also, let me highlight a few key implementation tasks. First, fish subsidies. The adoption of a new agreement on fisheries subsidies is a historic agreement. In the WTO's 27 years of existence, this is only the second time that it has concluded a full-fledged multilateral agreement, and the first time it has reached an agreement whose central purpose is to contribute to environmental sustainability. The new disciplines prohibit subsidies for illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing operations and for fishing of overexploited stocks, and it prohibits subsidies for fishing on the unregulated high seas. And this is a very significant outcome, not just for fish, but of course for the hundreds of millions of people around the world who depend on fish for their livelihoods. The agreement also establishes a funding mechanism to assist developing and least developed countries in implementing the agreement and putting in place fisheries management regimes to develop their industries sustainably. Now, it is now up to WTO members to do their part and complete their domestic acceptance procedures so that the agreement can enter into force and start delivering its sustainability benefits. Was saying, why not think about countries going with their domestic acceptance procedures within the next, say, 9 months, so that the agreement can come into effect sooner rather than later. Now, in addition, WTO members agreed to continue negotiations to adopt even more rigorous disciplines down the road. So that's another bit item in our to-do list. Second, the TRIPS waiver. This outcome clarifies the scope and streamlines the procedures that governments have to limit patent rights for COVID-19 vaccines. This outcome provides an additional flexibilities and concrete guidance that could implement for governments to implement other measures to diversify vaccine manufacturing capacity and export vaccines to countries in need. Now, ministers gave negotiators in Geneva 6 months to decide on the waiver's extension to cover the production and supply of COVID-19 diagnostics and therapeutics. Discussions on this started last week in the TRIPS Council. Now, on digital trade, members committed not to impose customs duties on electronic transmissions, which means that electronically transmitted trade from movies, music, and ebooks to software and digitally delivered business services can continue to move freely across borders. Now, failing to agree on the so-called moratorium, which has been in place since 1998, would have been a big blow to the global services and digital economy, including the millions of jobs and businesses that depend on it worldwide. On this key issue, ministers also agreed to intensify discussions on the scope, definition, and impact of the moratorium. And this provides a very good opportunity for delegations in Geneva to work with others to develop a strong evidence base that could inform their decisions about the moratorium in the future. On food insecurity, members agreed to exempt the World Food Programme's food purchases from export curbs, and they took steps to make trade in food, fertilizers, and other agricultural imports easier and more predictable, which is especially important in times like now when global supplies are tight and high prices threaten poor households around the world. Now, ministers tasked the WTO Secretariat to provide regular updates on food, trade, and market developments. And there's also a mandate to the Committee on Agriculture to have a dedicated work program in relation to agricultural reform and net food importing developing and least developed countries. Now, in agriculture, WTO members will also have to discuss how to move forward to reform agricultural trade policies, as they were not able to achieve an outcome on this at the ministerial. Our Director General has said that the lack of an outcome should prompt a fresh look at how the WTO can deliver in this important area, noting that domestic support in agriculture could total $1 trillion by 2030. Now, arguably, the most important outcome of the Ministerial Conference was the decision by ministers to launch a process to reform the WTO. And the reform process will address all functions: negotiations, dispute settlement, and monitoring and deliberation. The outcome explicitly highlights the urgency of addressing the challenges and concerns related to dispute settlement, including the appellate body, so that we can have a fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. Reforming the WTO is a very ambitious and challenging undertaking, and members will have to reflect carefully on how to move the process forward. One challenge, of course, is that WTO members do not always see eye to eye on what WTO reform should entail. So that's why one possible next step that members could take would be to develop a few, I would say maybe common sense, actionable and forward-looking, maybe principles that could guide the work on WTO reform going forward. And let me mention what 3 principles on WTO reform could look like. First, a fully functional global trading system needs a fully functional dispute settlement system. This is a priority because a rules-based system whose rules cannot be effectively enforced will lose part of its value and will find it increasingly difficult to develop new rules. We cannot expect, of course, easy solutions in this area, but at the same time, we're not starting from scratch. Some elements of the existing dispute settlement system continue to function effectively, and WTO members are showing creativity and flexibility in dealing with the current challenges. This will stand us in good stead as discussions on reforms get underway. The second principle, and I think, Monty, you were referring a bit to this, is that WTO members must be ready, in my view, to harness flexible approaches to negotiations. This does not mean that we should discard multilateral approaches based on consensus by all 164 WTO members. Far from it, and that is exactly what we did in the context of this Ministerial Conference. Yet, reliance on a single approach based on consensus by all members risks driving negotiating activity outside of the WTO. Consensus is very valuable, but it is also very difficult to achieve and might not be suited to deal with every single trade issue. So we need alternative approaches to complement and reinforce multilateral outcomes while allowing groups of like-minded countries to advance specific issues under the WTO umbrella openly and transparently. Plurilateral initiatives are one such approach. In recent years, we have seen groups of like-minded WTO members pursue so-called plurilateral initiatives on a broad range of issues, from services domestic regulations to e-commerce, to investment facilitation, to small businesses, to environmental sustainability. And not all WTO members are part of these initiatives, but very importantly, they are open to anyone who wants to join. At the Ministerial Conference, we saw innovations that could add much needed flexibility to WTO negotiations. One example can be found in the TRIPS waiver decision. In that decision, there is an inconspicuous footnote, footnote 1, whose purpose is to define the countries that can benefit from the flexibilities included in the intellectual property deal. The footnote creates an opt-out mechanism that could serve as a blueprint for dealing with a very thorny issue, which is the differentiation among WTO's increasingly diverse membership. Footnote 1 was negotiated jointly by the United States and China, and not surprisingly, it was the last piece of the ministerial to fall into place. That opt-out mechanism could work in 2 ways. First, it supports the adoption of responsibilities by emerging markets in the global trading system. While the footnote declares that all developing countries are eligible, it also encourages countries with existing capacity to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines to make a binding commitment to opt out of the decision. And that is exactly what China did. Second, the opt-out in footnote 1 of the IP decision also works to facilitate multilateral outcomes by allowing those members that cannot join a particular outcome to stay out, bringing much needed flexibility to the global trading system. The third and final principle I want to highlight is that there is no global trading system without transparency. Complete and timely information is what allows WTO members to engage in meaningful policy dialogue, peer pressure, and the pragmatic and cooperative resolution of trade frictions, all of which plays an outsized role in creating open, predictable, and stable trading conditions. So strengthening transparency across all areas of the WTO must be front and center in WTO reform discussions. In conclusion, let me say that MC12 helps put the WTO back in the game of trade policy reform. WTO members can and must step up and speed up their collaboration, not only to turn the recent decisions into change on the ground, but also to sustain the positive momentum coming out of the ministerial to make the WTO an even greater force for good in a world of overlapping and compounding crises. So let me stop here, Monty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. That was a very, very good summary and a very balanced assessment of the many achievements. I think it puts things in some perspective, because if you just go by the headlines, there's an emphasis always on the negative. But you're right that although the achievements were limited, they the WTO is back in play. But a lot of challenges remain to address these problems in future, and I'm sure other speakers will touch on that. The next speaker is Tim Yeen, the Associate Secretary DFAT in Australia. So Tim, can I ask you to pitch in at this point?
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you very much, Montek. It's great to see Pradeep there as well, and it's wonderful to see a whole range of very familiar faces, and certainly looking forward to the discussion. And I think Annabelle's really sort of framed the discussion very well, and I'm just going to try to build on some of the things that have come up in the discussion. I don't think I'll be quite as comprehensive as she's been, because she's set such a good framework for the discussion. But certainly, I mean, for me, having come back to Australia into a national system, it's sort of interesting to see how much a country like Australia relies on a properly functioning rules-based system. And so, you know, getting back to what you were saying, Montek, about the need for, you know, and we all want sort of free and fair trade, and the only way to have that is you know, if you have a properly functioning rules-based multilateral trading system. So I think, you know, in this context, it was really great to see the outcomes from MC12. I think that, you know, the meeting exceeded most people's expectations, and that's a good thing for the WTO and the multilateral trading system. And I think also importantly, it's always easier to look ahead and to try to plan ahead off the back of a successful ministerial meeting. And that's certainly been my experience when I look at meetings like the ministerial in Bali or in Nairobi. The sense that you had some positive momentum, I think, really made it easier to try and continue the discussion of, you know, looking at ways to strengthen and improve the multilateral trading system. So I think there's no doubt that having that positive outcome is something we should build from. I think, though, we shouldn't be starry-eyed about that. I think the ministerial, as I saw it, I was in Geneva for MC12, just like you know, the other ministerials I refer to, and I did work in the Secretariat at, you know, Bali and Nairobi. You really saw that there are some pretty serious problems in the system, in its governance and in the way it operates. And I think some of the issues where that gets us into this discussion about WTO reform, where you know, I don't think that we can just continue sort of doing things the way that we've been doing them for many years. I think that you know, this is why the MC12 decision to have a more focused and serious discussion about WTO reform is so important. And you know, in that discussion, I think, yes, the papers were sort of drawing attention to things like consensus decision making, but there are a raft of other issues that I think it's very important to discuss and to think about. And Annabelle's mentioned some of them, but there's of course the issues around special and differential treatment and how we deal with developing countries where that's right. We've learned some things from the TRIPS waiver discussions, just like we learned from the trade facilitation agreement as well, in how we might find ways to approach issues related to development in a more pragmatic fashion that I think might be easier to coalesce around. But there are issues as well around things like MFN. And reciprocity, sort of concepts that, you know, in some ways sort of raise issues that some would argue that are at odds with the multilateral trading system, and how we, you know, we might need to find ways to address particular concerns of some members. But I think that this is all part of the discussion that we have to have on WTO reform, and I think we need a discussion that encompasses all of these things. Which is why having a discussion, you know, under the auspices of the, I can't quite remember the precise wording of the General Council, is a good thing, and a country like Australia will participate very actively in that. But I think certainly we won't see that as the only place to have this discussion. I think that for us, a lot of our energy in the last few years in Australia has been put into the question of plurilaterals, these so-called joint statement initiatives, we certainly see them as an important part of the discussion, and that we have seen that by leading the discussions and being involved in the discussions on the plurilaterals, the fact that you're actually doing it and negotiating it, it's an easier environment to find solutions to some of these problems. And we certainly don't see, I mean, I wouldn't quite agree with the way that plurilaterals were being characterised a bit as a second best alternative. I mean, as we see it, if they're done the right way, they've always been part of the fabric of the multilateral trading system. If you look at these JSIs, they're, you know, anyone can participate if they want to. So they're very inclusive, and, you know, we would say that they are part of the multilateral system. They build towards multilateral outcomes if they're done in the right way. So, you know, we certainly wouldn't be turning our back on trying to sort of reach agreement multilaterally, but I think we've seen time and time again that it's not that easy, and we really need to have other alternatives in place, and that's certainly the approach we'll be taking going forward as we start this more focused discussion on the question of reform of the WTO. I'll just say a few words finally on it, on perhaps the key, if not certainly one of the most important sort of areas of reform, and that is dispute settlement. It gets back to what I was saying at the outset, the importance of the rules-based system is why an effective functioning dispute settlement system is so important. This was another very welcome outcome from the Ministerial, that we now will have a more focused discussion on attempting to get the dispute settlement system functioning again. And we certainly think that in doing that, we do have to think outside the box. We have to be creative and perhaps innovative in responding to the concerns that we've had raised over the last few years from the US and others. But I think this can be done as long as some of the key principles around the need for that system, the need for a proper review process, and measures that safeguard the independence of the system as long as we can meet those kind of criteria, you know, we think that we should be prepared to really think outside the box in how we put the dispute settlement system back together. And in that regard, Australia and I think 24 other countries have already been having this discussion for some time through the so-called MPIA arrangement, and there are some ideas and concepts in there that we think could be very relevant to how we now take this this discussion forward. But I'd certainly agree with Annabelle that while it didn't get the attention, I do think that the WTO reform decision is perhaps the, you know, certainly one of, but if not the most important sort of outcome from the Ministerial Conference. Business as usual just won't cut it. I think we do need to take a new, fresh look at how the system is operating. Some of these key principles behind the way the WTO is operated, I think need to be looked at with a fresh set of eyes by us all. But I am confident that this can be done without disturbing the foundational principles of the WTO at the same time. So we certainly don't see, there's nothing to be worried here. It's a discussion that we really need to have, and we can do it as a way of strengthening and building the support and establishing again the relevance of the WTO to the global trading system. So Montec, I might just leave it there. I am interested to hear from others as well. And just as I finish, just unfortunately, I do have to leave at 9 o'clock Canberra time. I'm not quite sure what time that translates to in India, but I think it's about another half hour or so. And I'll certainly look forward to listening to the discussion up until the point at which I have to go to another meeting. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Tim. Actually, if you have to leave, then my suggestion is that just before leaving, if you want a two-hander or something, maybe we'd like to hear what you have to say to respond to what's been said. So just kind of let's do that, and we'll earmark 3 minutes for you. Okay? So if you send a message to Pradeep, his guys will take care of that. So the next speaker is Simon Evenet, professor at the University of St. Gallen. Simon?
Thank you very much. And I've been given the task of discussing the very opt-out provisions which Tim and Annabelle were talking about earlier in the context of the TRIPS waiver decision. Many ways, Tim has set this up very nicely. We have a long-standing sort of stone in the shoe that is the WTO, which is special and differential treatment. We have to figure out some way forward here. And my understanding of this decision is that when we are creating a new flexibility, we are allowing some developing countries to choose whether to not to avail themselves of this. So essentially, a country can decide, no, they will not take advantage of this flexibility. Now, in light of the problems the Americans in particular have had of certain large developing countries having availabilities, flexibilities because of their self-declared developing country status, I mean, I can see the attraction of this going forward as something which, a model that could be used again. However, a couple of points I think which are worth making here. It does seem to me that this innovation is one which is only applicable when you're creating new flexibilities. So it seems it's very much in the context of that. Second, it seems to suggest that the precedent might be one where a developing country decides whether or not to avail themselves of these flexibilities on a case-by-case basis. And so who knows whether just because one country decided not to avail themselves of these flexibilities in the past doesn't mean they will in the future. So there's no general assurance there. And I guess the third point to make is where the willingness, I guess, of some developing countries to not to take these flexibilities will depend on how meaningful they think the flexibilities introduced in the first place are. And here, of course, we get to the nub of the TRIPS waiver or TRIPS decision discussion, which is to what extent is it a meaningful way forward? or was it a face-saving device to help the governments of India and the United States to come down off a ledge which they'd managed to get themselves onto? And so, again, these, I think, are the different points. I'm not going to take a position on that last point, but I do run into very knowledgeable people who refer to the TRIPS decision as a decision and not as a waiver, because they don't believe it is a waiver at all. So that is, so I think that's what I would like to say about the issue of the TRIPS waiver and this opt-out provision. Tim has also noted the other, I think, really interesting innovation over the years was, of course, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which tried to combine obligations with support. I always thought that was a much more, that's an interesting model, not for the case when you're creating new flexibilities, but actually when you're creating new obligations. So you can see maybe the toolbox is being innovated or developed in interesting ways along those two different dimensions. So let us not forget the important work which was done there. Now, to the broader question about what to make of MC12, like everyone else, my expectations were completely exceeded, and I'll put that on the table. I'm delighted that this happened. The WTO lives to fight another day. I think the interesting question is what will be made of this opportunity, okay? And here again, my thoughts did go back to the Bali Ministerial, where we had another ministerial where, quite frankly, expectations were exceeded with the agreement on trade facilitation. It was a great outcome. And then the question was, what came next? And unfortunately, we saw the momentum unravel very, very quickly. Okay, credit was given then to a new Director General, just like it is now. Some countries also highlighted that the WTO desperately needed a win then, as it did now. And some also argued that the reason that the Bali was a success was because of a lot of forbearance on the part of some WTO members who could have asked for things but didn't. So there's very strong parallels between then and now. And unfortunately, of course, we know what happened after Bali, which was next to nothing. And one has to wonder what's the factor which is going to keep momentum going forward. That's just one observation to put on the table. The second observation to put on the table, a little bit triggered by Tim's and Annabelle's comments, is to what extent is the problem generated in Geneva? We do have some problems which were generated in Geneva. Arguably, the dispute settlement system's performance and the decisions which were taken in Geneva by various parties involved in that. This is entirely, largely Geneva-based, quite frankly, with the appellate body being not exactly managed in a way which kept everyone on board. But how many problems are also based in national capitals? And here I go back to the Bali Ministerial again. I was rereading the Financial Times coverage of the Bali Ministerial, and there was a fight in the Bali Ministerial between, guess who? India and the United States. This time it was on public food stock holding. Essentially, the Financial Times reported a number of diplomats quoting them, quoted a number of diplomats, all of whom saying this was about finding a face-saving solution for both countries' domestic politics. And we ended up with a two-page declaration, if I remember rightly. The first page written for the benefit of India, the second for the United States, and both pages are orthogonal to one another in terms of content. So we've had this problem before, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And it does make me wonder if the problem is really in Geneva, or how much of the problem is in Geneva, and how much of the problem is in dysfunctional trade politics in a number of key WTO members. And I've mentioned two, but I'm sure there are other countries where we have dysfunctional trade politics as well. And so maybe the problem is a little bit at home as well, not just in Geneva. So these discussions, of course, are very important. Richard Baldwin and I have written extensively on how to, different ideas on how to reform the WTO and how to bring people together. So there's no shortage of ideas to talk about, but we must do our homework at home, building up the support for trade reform and the support for multilateralism. And the countries which have failed to do that are the ones which keep time after time creating dramas at these WTO ministerial conferences. Thank you very much.
Montek, I think you're muted.
Sorry. That was very, very instructive and give a lot of food for thought. I agree entirely, by the way, that the problem cannot entirely be dumped in the lap of Geneva. There's a lot that really relates to headquarters activity. And I think we all need to think about that. So the next speaker is Victor Do Prado, Senior Fellow of SEBRI. So Victor, all up to you now.
Thank you very much, Montek. Thank you, Pradeep, for the invitation, and greetings to my fellow panelists, good friends, and to the audience. Great to be here. A famous Italian Renaissance philosopher once wrote that virtue and fortune are the two most influential forces in politics. Of course, he was referring to the personal qualities of a ruler, but I guess we can also apply these forces, virtue and fortune, to a collective effort. And I guess in MC12, these two forces were also at play. The conference was the result of a collective effort. And as such, it was determined by a lot of background work during an extended period of time. It was determined by the intelligent steering of different negotiating tracks, by the pulling together of collective work, and that is virtue. We know how virtuous people like Annabelle are, and how hard they have worked in putting together the results of MC12, together with the secretariat, together with the DG. Tim referred, and I think Simon, to Bali. There's a certain tradition in the WTO of getting, fresh people with a lot of enthusiasm to deliver results in the first ministerial of the new administration. This has always happened, and we hope it continues to happen. Now, we also know that at every venture like a ministerial conference, there is a part of imponderables, of sort of random circumstances, of personal chemistry or lack thereof, of situations that are beyond one's control and planning, and that have to do with pure luck, and that is fortune. Now, the MC12, as we know, had its own doses of good fortune, and that's great. So Pradeep asked me, Victor's, could you expand on what went right and what went less right in MC12? Well, what we know went right was there was a lot of work, there was a good doses of luck. We also know that the US and China sat down to negotiate that opt-out footnote in the TRIPS decision that Annabelle referred to, and that was welcome. I think this is something that was instrumental in getting the conference to a success. Let me say it quite bluntly, Montek, if you allow me. It seems like India this time around would have been a bit more cooperative than it was in some of the past ministerials. And I guess this played a role as well, apart from everything that I have mentioned. And there's one could expand a lot on what went right. What went sort of less right? Well, I guess we all need to accept that the results fell somewhat short of expectations of some delegations. And Annabelle herself mentioned agriculture. It is the one area that is lacking in there, and this is important for many countries. And I guess this is something that we need to accept, that agriculture will need to be worked out in the future. But again, to quote another famous politician, Bismarck said that the politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best. I'm not going to qualify MC12 as the second best. I think it exceeded many people's expectations, but there was a price, and that price was somewhat of a lowered result in terms of the agreement on fisheries, for example, where there is an inbuilt agenda with a log-off timer or an encouragement, depending on how you want to see it. And there is not much guidance in terms of how the reform discussion will be organized or conducted. So I'm going to expand a little bit on, very quickly, on those areas of reform, namely dispute settlement, negotiation, and monitoring, and ask some questions. Because Annabelle spelled out some principles, I actually have some questions. So regarding dispute settlement, I think everybody agrees that dispute settlement is crucial. Now, do members want dispute settlement in the future to be impartial? And I think the reply to that is yes. Second question, is the mechanism going to be two-tiered? Namely, is there a review mechanism? Question mark. Third, will the results of the dispute settlement procedure be binding? We had all those three things in the past. We do not necessarily have them now, right? So I think it's fair to ask, is it impartial? Is it going to be two-tiered? Is it going to be binding? And the last question is, what happens to the precedent? What happens to the acquis, all of the decisions that were there in the past? So I think these questions should be replied to or thought through as we think about dispute settlement in the future. As far as negotiations are concerned, we spoke about flexibilities, we spoke about plurilaterals. There's a tough question there. Will the results of the plurilaterals be applied MFN? Are we all in agreement with that? I think many people are, but I think the question needs to be asked because some people might not think that way. And also the question of special and differential treatment. Simon has already dwelt on that. I'm not going to repeat it. Finally, on the monitoring and transparency, there's a question here. Things need to be improved. Now, are we going to improve them through a carrot or through a stick? There are proposals of using a stick to make people comply with monitoring and notifications. Could there be a carrot? Could there be technical assistance? And I think this is something that also needs to be thought through. So a lot of work ahead, high expectations. I think MC12 was an important, very important and welcome stepping stone. Now let's see what MC13 is going to be able to deliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you also for drawing attention to the fact that India is very often less supportive of forward movement than we like to think internally. And this is actually a big task for Pradeep, to make people more aware that although our self-image is one of determined supporters of multilateralism, it is true that many of my foreign friends tell me that they often feel that we are one of the biggest opponents. And only someone with Pradeep's kind of explication skills can make this known. So thank you for, I appreciate that remark, and India needs to think a lot more about it. So, I said to Tim, who I think is about to leave, that if he wanted to pitch in, we'd give him a few minutes. So Tim, if you're still there and listening, do you want to come in?
No, look, thanks, Monty. It's great to have been able to listen to Simon and Victor's comments as well. I think they've set out some of the issues that we need to to factor in going forward in the discussions. It's a little bit like I was saying, I think we can't be too starry-eyed. There are some real problems that we need to face up to. I do think some of the, these fundamental principles, Victor was asking about things like MFN, about, are there ways that we can, try to pursue MFN outcomes, but in a way that let members also try to pursue agreements and make progress. And to tell the truth, in some of the plurilateral discussions, we are making progress in that regard. And these are certainly ideas and concepts that we, Australia, will be bringing forward into the discussions as we go forward next year. I was trying not to look too parochial, but Victor mentioned agriculture. And just to say that really that is an area of extreme frustration I think for many of us, that it seems to be so difficult to make progress on agriculture. And just to say that we, and I think the CANS group of countries, we are certainly going to be looking very seriously at agriculture with a fresh set of eyes as well, to see if we can find a way forward instead of just going back into the same old discussions. And we certainly encourage India and others on issues like public stockholding to be doing the same. So we can move all of these issues forward because agriculture is just such a fundamental part of the WTO's work. But look, thank you. I'm sorry I do have to leave. It's one of the working again back in a national government. I have a meeting with the minister in a few minutes, so it's been so nice to have the chance to talk, and I'm sorry I won't be able to listen to all of the presentations, but I'll certainly stay in touch with you all, because this is a very important discussion that we're having. So thanks again, Montec, for giving me this quick opportunity just to speak again.
Thank you, and have a good
If
meeting.
I may, Montec, if I may, Tim, this is being recorded, so you could, if you wish to revisit, you're welcome to do that.
Well, there you go. I definitely will do that. So thank you very much, Pradeep. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And this is for everyone.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Pradeep. Now, I think our next speaker is Stephen Olson, Senior Research Fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Stephen?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Heinrich Foundation, I'd like to thank CUTS for their kind invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Now, before I share some thoughts about what the future might hold for the WTO, I think it's important to take stock of where we are today in the aftermath of the Ministerial 12. I've been discussing, I think generally speaking, the reaction to MC12 has been fairly positive. The results have been hailed largely as a success and as a significant accomplishment. My perspective, unfortunately, is quite a bit different. I think that the only way that we could judge the outcomes from MC12 as a success would be if we set the bar for success so low that it's practically touching the ground. Let's face it, these are not normal circumstances. These are not normal days. The WTO house is on fire. And when the house is on fire, simply throwing a single bucket of water on the house fire, I don't think is a success. And I don't think is sufficient. And frankly speaking, I'm not even sure if the outcomes from MC12 constitute a full bucket of water. We've got an agreement to extend the digital trade duty moratorium, which in essence is an agreement simply to refrain from imposing additional barriers. Now, traditionally and typically, we would judge success at the WTO or the GATT before it based on how many trade restrictions were eliminated. But I think it's a telling commentary that now, simply avoiding the imposition of new tariffs, of new restrictions, that's considered to be a success. We've got, of course, the IP waiver that Simon talked a bit about on the COVID vaccines. And here, just to be completely candid and completely blunt among friends, it's just too little too late to have any meaningful impact on the coronavirus pandemic. Less developed countries, by and large, have reached the point where they're saying, no, thank you. No, thank you. We don't need more vaccines. Please don't donate more vaccines to us. We can't use all of the vaccines we already have. We've got an agreement on fisheries subsidies, which is positive. But the major achievement there seems to be that we've agreed to stop subsidizing people to break the law. Most of the disciplines apply to illegal, unregulated, or unreported fishing activities, and leaves a very large portion of global fishing activities untouched. We've got some agreement on ag, and there's some positive developments there, especially with regard to World Food Program exports. But again, there, some of the real nettlesome issues, public stockholding of food, et cetera, were basically sidestepped. And on the issue that's nearest and dearest to my own heart, that I think is the most important challenge and issue facing the WTO, which is WTO reform, we've basically got an agreement to talk about talking. We've got an agreement that we're going to launch some discussions. We've got some ambitious, extremely ambitious deadlines for agreement, but in essence, nothing concrete beyond an agreement to talk about talking. So how did we arrive at this state of affairs? How did we get here? Well, and what does that suggest about where we might be headed in the future? Well, I want to share a perspective with you that some of you might think is a little bit sentimental, and some of you might even think that it's a little bit naive. But I firmly believe that one of the underappreciated reasons for the success that we've had in the past in first establishing a rules-based system in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then managing it effectively and growing it effectively, has been that there has always been a very high degree of trust among participants, a high degree of trust and a sense that we were involved in a common endeavor, a common mutually beneficial endeavor, and that the best way to promote your national interests was to work hard to ensure the integrity of the overall system and to ensure that the overall system was working to everybody's benefit. Now, sadly, I think that sense of trust and I think that sense of being involved in a mutually beneficial endeavor, I think it's been badly eroded. And I think that's a large, and again, perhaps that sounds a little bit sentimental, but I think that's a large part of the explanation of how we arrived at where we are today. And as we know, in any human endeavor, whether we're talking about trade governance or any other aspect of human life, once trade and once trust has been diminished, once trust has been broken, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to restore. So what does all this then suggest about where we might be headed in the future as far as the WTO is concerned? Well, look, despite everything that I just said, I do not think that we should give up on the WTO. And as a matter of fact, I think the WTO still has a critical role to play. And I think the WTO still has important contributions it can make. But, and this is a very big but, I think we need to adjust our expectations for what the WTO can accomplish. I don't think it's realistic to think that the WTO can play the role that we all hoped it would play and expected it would play when the WTO opened its doors on January 1st, 1995. And I think we've got to bring our expectations for the organization more in line with reality. Now, broadly speaking, when we first established the WTO, the WTO was intended to execute primarily three functions. One was to be the leading vehicle to move the ball forward on multilateral trade and investment liberalization. The second area was to be an effective global trade referee and keep everybody in line. And the third was what I refer to, for lack of a more elegant or a more eloquent way of saying it, the third area I would kind of group together into a miscellaneous basket category of unglamorous stuff. Unglamorous stuff, but still critically important stuff. Things like trade facilitation, okay? Now, look, if we look at these areas of functional responsibility, I don't see any realistic prospect in the foreseeable future that the WTO is going to play the lead role in moving the multilateral trade and investment liberalization agenda forward. We've got 164 members. We operate on the basis of consensus, and we've got wildly divergent viewpoints on most of the toughest issues. Now, the plurilateral track, I think, holds promise. I think that's the best bet where we could see some progress in the WTO. But even there, we've been smashing our head against a lot of brick walls, right? I mean, if you ask me if there was one area where a motivated, self-selected subset of WTO members could make progress, it would be, surely we can agree to eliminate tariffs on environmental goods, right? Surely that's got to be a slam dunk. But we know that has hit a lot of roadblocks and has not gone as well as we would have hoped. The second functional area, the WTO, through its dispute settlement mechanism, was intended to be a global trade referee. Well, let's make the most optimistic assumption that we possibly can. Let's assume we can wave a magic wand, and tomorrow morning, the appellate body impasse has been completely resolved and the dispute settlement function has been completely restored. The WTO still cannot act as an effective global trade referee because the WTO rule book is hopelessly out of date. It either doesn't cover or doesn't adequately cover those areas where an increasing portion of trade is taking place: digital trade, services. And in the areas where we've got the toughest disputes, and that is the points of friction between market economies and non-market economies, the rule book is either completely silent or it falls into gray areas. So I don't know if we can hold out much reasonable expectation that the WTO can play that role as a global trade referee. Now, when we get to that third category that I refer to as the miscellaneous, unglamorous stuff, here's where I think the WTO has done fantastic work. And I think it can continue to do fantastic work. This whole issue of trade facilitation, again, it puts people to sleep, right? It doesn't lend itself to exciting headlines, but this is immensely important to global trade, and it's immensely important in particular to less developed countries. The whole issue of capacity building and technical assistance, the WTO has done fantastic work here and can continue to make even greater contributions there. Again, helping less developed countries benefit from the global trading system. And in one area which is, kind of treated like vanilla ice cream, everybody kind of nods, but I don't think it gets the credit it deserves. I think transparency is incredibly important. And I think that the work that the WTO does in just helping members have greater visibility into the trade policies and trade practices of the trade partners, I think that's extraordinarily important. Again, not glamorous, but still incredibly important. I made a comment, I'll repeat a comment I made in a session about 3 hours ago earlier today that I was on with Simon Evanet, but this is a big part of the reason why I value so much the work that Simon and his colleagues at Global Trade Alert do, because the simple act of shining a spotlight on what are the actual policies and what are governments actually doing is immensely beneficial. And the work that Simon and his colleagues does is fantastic, and the work and the role that the WTO plays in this area is incredibly important. So I think that's a place where the WTO can make substantial contributions. Finally, in closing, let me just say, I believe in the WTO. I believe in the role the WTO can play, and I think the WTO has substantial contributions it can make. But just again, being very frank here among friends and like-minded colleagues, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we cling to unrealistic expectations about the role the WTO can play and what it can achieve. Let's maximize those areas where the WTO has got a reasonable shot at constructively contributing to progress. And let's think pragmatically and outside of the box on how we're going to attack some of these nettlesome difficulties that we probably should no longer expect the WTO to play a leadership role. So maximize where we know the WTO can deliver and get the job done, and expand our minds and think pragmatically about how we're going to tackle those other areas. I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to our discussion and Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was really very, very meaty and much to think about in your comment. I just want to make one little observation. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. The point you made about the reason things were a lot easier earlier, because it was a world there was trust. But the truth is, the trust was a consequence, essentially, of the US playing the role of a very benign hegemon. I mean, the credit really goes to the US for actually being a benign hegemon. And I think as its relative economic strength eroded, which was bound to happen, and it was actually an indication of the fact that the globalization was working, it naturally changed its own positions. And I don't think we put in place a collective, equally benign hegemonic grouping. This has, of course, become a lot more complicated with the geopolitical fractioning that's taking place right now in the global economy, and exactly how the WTO can handle that is beyond my analytical skills, but it's something I'm trying to think about. But that was just to say that it wasn't just trust. It was a world. It was a global situation where people perceived that U.S. was doing a lot of things which in the long run it felt were in its interest, but were more obviously giving a lot of concessions to a whole lot of countries. And I think that has more or less vanished since then. Anyway, our last sorry?
Could I sneak in one quick comment? I think there's a lot of validity in what you say, but I think there's another important factor, because if we go back to the dawn of the global trade system in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, we'd been through hell and back. We were traumatized. We'd been through 2 world wars and a global depression in an incredibly short period of time. And there was a sense that we really screwed up. Whatever we were doing in the past, it did not work. 2 world wars and one global depression, correctly or incorrectly attributed largely to protectionism. And so there was a real sense, we got to pull it together. We don't want World War III to break out in 1960, and we don't want a second great. So there's a real motivation, because of the hell that we've been through, to work together and row the boat in the same direction. And that just naturally dissipated over the decades.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. That a very valuable correction to the way I put it. I accept that. The last speaker on our list is Hamid Mamdoon, Senior Legal Counsel of King and Spalding. Hamid, may I request you to make your remarks?
Thank you very much, Montag, and thank you, Pradeep, for the invitation, and thank you for inviting me to speak class, because this will give me the opportunity to make comments on some of the things that I heard, and not necessarily follow a rigid structure, because a lot has been said already. But let me start basically with agreeing with what was said about the results of MC12. I think what we ended up with is an agenda, tremendous agenda. We didn't end up with a lot of conclusions, closures on issues. So basically, we need to be aware of the fact that we make up. And of course, the kind of analogy with the valley of success and what followed in terms of fighting momentum is something that we should see as a trap that we shouldn't fall into. So we should really, really try to get up and running as quickly as possible. Now, I would focus among the outcomes on what I would consider the most important element in the outcome, and that's WTO reform. Because I think it's been long coming that we discussed WTO reform in the WTO. It's been discussed in so many other places, except in the WTO. Of course, a good thing about this is that we have a very flexible mandate, just an agreement to talk, because it would have been a mistake to try and pre-negotiate what the agenda is going to look like, because I will come to that in a minute. But I think when a situation like this, it might be very helpful to have a bit of a diagnostic view about why we are where we are. Why are we in this situation? And I've identified 3 mega trends that have been actually on the rise over the past, say, life of the WTO, 27 years. The first, I think, is, and the most important, is the evolution of WTO membership itself. And by evolution, I mean not just the numbers of adding acceding members, but the diversity, increasing diversity among members of the WTO, including within that diversity also the power shift within geopolitical sphere, which are eventually causing trade tension and complicating everybody's life. Now, that's the first mega trend. The second, which is particular to people like us who look with analytical eyes, is the increasing complexity of trade policy issues, the issues that come to the negotiating table. This interface between complex regulatory responses to new technology and trade liberalization. How do you reconcile cross-border in electronic or e-commerce generally with the rising tide of regulations on privacy, on online consumer protection, cybersecurity, and the rest? That actually puts a heavy demand on the capabilities of the rule-making function of the WTO. And then the third is that the 3 vital functions of the WTO have been gradually diminishing. And the 3 vital functions, I think, are very important to focus on. There's been a lot of mention of that, and I'll come to that in a minute in terms of the approach to the reform, because I think there is something about the systemic vision here that puts the 3 functions together in a sort of a harmonious and a coherent framework. Now, the reality here is that the first and second mega trend, which is the diversity among members and tensions, plus the increasing complexity, have placed a lot of demands on the system. Yet, the breakdown in the 3 functions, and particularly rulemaking, has widened the gap between the phenomena that we're seeing and the capacity of the WTO to deliver. And that gap has led to a loss of faith. I'm sorry to use such a dramatic term, but or a faith deficit among the business community. And this is terribly serious from the WTO systemic point of view, because the business community are the end users of whatever is done in the WTO. They have gradually lost faith that the WTO would be the place for them to resolve their problems. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about WTO reform. Now, the system, of course, was designed with a built-in negotiating function that is supposed to have continuously updated the rule book as we went forward in a rapidly changing world. But the breakdown in the negotiating function has not allowed this to happen. And here, if I may open a parenthesis and comment a bit on what Montek said at the beginning about fair and free trade and whether there is contradiction between the two, and whether this can be looked at in terms of moving towards plurilateral as well as multilateral. And here I want to really, really emphasize the reality that is so often not recognized, and that is plurilateral initiatives are indeed part of the multilateral system. This is not something that we should look at as something new that we are adopting or something new that we're going to be flexible towards. Over the past 70 years of negotiating history in the system, negotiating initiatives launched by a subset of the members has been a common practice. Now, the politics of the WTO has blurred the clarity of WTO rules. They're actually, here I would suggest that we should distinguish between processes and outcomes. Launching a plurilateral process is not something for which there are any rules that require a consensus decision. It just does not exist in the WTO if it is something covered by existing WTO agreements. It's only when you have an outcome that you want to integrate into the treaty architecture of the WTO that legal questions arise. And there are clear rules for integrating such negotiating outcomes in the WTO. They're carefully designed to protect the pre-existing rights of non-participants. So the tools are there. We just need to have a sensible conversation about how plurilateral initiatives are going to fit into the broader context of the WTO negotiating function. And the WTO was actually never designed to be a one-speed system. This is something we need to remind ourselves of. Otherwise, we wouldn't have special differential treatment, we wouldn't have special consideration for least developed countries. It wasn't designed at all to mean that unless something is done by the 164, then it cannot be done. Where is that written in the rules? It is not. This is just an example. I opened a parenthesis, now I close the parenthesis because I was commenting on what Montek was saying and what was said about plurilaterals. But let's go back to the main point I was making about WTO reform and what should the approach to WTO reform be. In my view, with all those changes over the past 27 years of the life of the organization, we need to go back to the fundamentals. Do we believe in the common purpose behind the WTO? And the common purpose is not trade liberalization or market opening. This has never actually been the main success story of the system. But the real success story of the system is that it is rules-based. Why? Because trade is important for all countries for growth and development. And in order for trade to flourish, we need predictability and stability in trading conditions. And for that, we need a rules-based system, not a power-based system. Now, do we still believe in that? Can we reaffirm all that? If that is true, then the next step would be, okay, how can we ensure that this would translate into again, a reaffirmation of the foundational principles that we all agree on? It's non-discrimination, transparency, special and differential treatment, all the principles that are there. Now, once there is a political agreement on this and a coherent interpretation in the minds of different parties, then we can move on to say, all right, the next step is how do we ensure that the three vital functions actually serve the common purpose in accordance with the foundational principles. That kind of sort of coherent approach, I think, is necessary to guide the discussion from the beginning so that we all make sure that we are on the same page. And maybe for some members, the common purpose is no longer common. that's fine. But it has to be admitted with political courage and intellectual clarity and honesty. Now, it's important to see how the system was created, because there is a logic to the institutional treaty structure of the WTO as it exists now. And what we need is just a political vision about where do we want to take the WTO reform process. And just to answer the question that Pradeep put in the flyer, WTO reform or the WTO of the future, I think a meaningful reform process will produce the WTO of the future. That is the whole idea. There's a great deal of updating that is needed and rebooting the system in order to correspond with today's realities. Now, that new vision should come from capitals. I agree that not all the problems are made in Geneva. No, Geneva has been dysfunctional to some extent because of the absence of a vision about where to take the system forward. Now, before I conclude, I was asked to also make comments about the dispute settlement system. Now, here I don't think, honestly, that it would be possible to advance on the dispute settlement system reform in absence of progress on other aspects of WTO reform. I don't think this can be taken forward in isolation from a holistic approach to WTO reform. There are important linkages between having a functional dispute settlement mechanism and updating the rules book. It's just a reality, because some important members do not want to enforce rules they don't like or rules they don't see adequate. And there are areas of rulemaking that have been mentioned, whether it's digital trade, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and the list goes on and on. But these are the ones that cause most friction. So in terms of timing, by 2024, well, it depends on how we progress on the entirety of WTO reform. And we would need, when we talk about dispute settlement, to go back to the fundamentals. Do we need a two-stage dispute settlement mechanism? Because this has been questioned. It also helps to go back to history. Why did we have it that way? We had it that way because A, we wanted a binding dispute settlement mechanism. We wanted an expeditious dispute settlement procedure in Geneva that would have a time frame shorter than 301 in Washington to disincentivize unilateral measures. And in order to achieve that, we needed automaticity in the adoption of panel reports. And in order to achieve that automaticity, we needed to have the possibility of an appeals procedure. Now, that's how this came together. Now, we want to dismantle it and have something else, fine. But it's important to see the purpose behind the existing and the logic behind the existing structure so that we can go forward. But luckily also on dispute settlement, we're not starting from scratch. There's the great work that was done by David Walker, and we can certainly build on that. Now, these are my comments, and thank you once again to you, Pradeep, and Montek, and my excellent lineup of co-panelists, and thank you to the audience as well for their attention. So back to you, Montek.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I really learned a lot from those comments, and I will go through the written record very carefully in order to make sure that I don't miss anything. I don't know, Pradeep, how do you want to do the next round? I mean, everybody gets a chance to another bite at the cherry to comment on what's happened. I don't think we have too many questions in the chat box, but I'll leave it to you.
We have two questions. One is to Annabelle and the other is to Simon. If I may read it out.
Listen, why don't you give those?
It's still in the chat box. Annabelle, to you, there's a question from Vipul Chatterjee. Can we have WTO provisions to discipline exports, particularly agriculture exports? And Simon, for you, for new issues, can we consider the TFA as a template? Countries on their own determining their commitments and implementation schedule. Thank you.
So thank you, Pradeep. So very briefly
It's
to
good.
say,
Annabelle, just a minute. And Monty, just to answer your question, Annabelle and other panelists are welcome to also comment on other panelists'
Yeah,
remarks
that's what I meant. Yeah. Okay.
within a short while, as soon as they can.
yeah. So I'll just answer briefly to say that there are WTO provisions to discipline export subsidies that were adopted in 2015, and there are also disciplines to govern export restrictions. There is increasing concern about whether those restrictions should be strengthened or not, but there are already existing WTO disciplines in these areas. So while I'm on the floor, using the floor, let me just make 3 comments, and I apologize because I will need to leave. So this has been a great discussion. Many good points have been made, and it's hard to think about tackling all of them. But I wanna sort of take sort of like a broader perspective and refer to 3 of them. The first one is that all countries, and the poorest in particular, but this is true for all countries, need an open global economy to grow and prosper. And the WTO has a key role to play in keeping markets open and managing trade frictions. And I would argue that even in the context of crisis in which we are today, the WTO has been doing that pretty much. So I do not think that the reason why trade cooperation is difficult means that we should opt for no trade cooperation, because that trade cooperation is absolutely essential for keeping markets open, but it's also critical in the world today to address some of the global challenges that we face. It has been critical to address the challenges of the pandemic. I think it can play a very important role in helping to address challenges associated with climate change, and more broadly, some of these problems again facing the world, sort of global problems. The second point that I want to make is that for the WTO to properly function in the current world and help to address all of these challenges that I was making reference to, it needs to be reformed. I think that is absolutely true. Now, the fact that this reform is difficult and the fact that countries have different views about this reform, again, in no way demerits the need for a reform. And I for one, without being Pollyannish, I am hopeful that the reform can take place. And I would even argue that part of the reform is already taking place, even without us acknowledging it as such. Some of these important conversations about on the plurilateral negotiations, this is the reform happening as we speak. Now, more is needed. And I do believe that it's very important for members to focus on this particular issue in going forward. And the third point that I would just want to highlight is that, one can have, you can assess the results of MC12 in different ways, and you may attach greater weight, to one thing or to another. But I do want to say one thing, which I am sure everyone would agree with, which is failure to achieve results at MC12 would have been devastating for the WTO and for global trade cooperation. So, you may think that they are great results. You may think they're not that great. You can have different ways of looking at them. But what is clear to me is that the counterfactual would have been very detrimental. So, with that, I would say, well, the work needs to go forward. And yes, much more work is needed. Yes, it's not going to be easy, but if we keep this broad picture in mind, I do think that can be a very important sort of guiding light of our work here. So with that, I'm sorry, Pradeep, I need to run to another event. Thank you very much for having me.
Annabelle, can I just ask you one question?
Yeah.
In the first event of this nature, of this series, Pascal Lamy had raised an important point that, you know, if you do not agree with the consensus, then you have to specify the reasons why you are not doing it. That rule doesn't, there's no such rule, with the result that anybody can get over that I don't like your face. And why you don't like my face, I don't know.
Well, you know, I think this has been sort of like the interpretation that we have given to this, but there's nothing, you know, written in stone that says, you know, members can just say, I disagree, and I don't say why, and I don't care. There's nothing, there's no rule in the WTO
Should we
that
have a
that is
rule?
the way it should function. There's a rule on consensus, but
Yeah.
when one can have, you know, a long conversation around that. My point is also that a lot of what, you know, there are a lot of things that can be changed at the WTO that does not require a change in the rules, but it does require a change in the culture, a change in the way in which we do things. And that is something where a lot of members I've been listening to recently are beginning to talk about this. And I'm sure that, you know, Victor, Hamid, others who have great experience in this can say much more than I can. Thank you very much. I got to rush. Thanks for the really great
Thank you very
comments by
much.
you, and thanks for organizing. Bye-bye.
Montek, over to you. There are two questions. One is to Simon and the other is to Stephen.
Maybe I'll jump in and try and answer the question that people has put to me. The short answer to the question is yes. Yes, I do think we could creatively find ways to link ambition in commitments to support that developing country members receive through various sources. How one does that depends will probably be very context specific, but I like the idea of taking off the table the implementation cost question and focusing on the value of the commitments and what they bring to a society's development. And so that might be a way of rethinking how we negotiate these agreements.
Good. Anyone else who wants to pitch in?
There is a question to Stephen. Montek?
Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, thank you very much. I think the question was regarding exports from SOEs in China. Look, I think this is part and parcel of what might be one of, if not the single biggest challenges that we face now in our rules-based global trading system, which is how do we manage the incompatibilities between market-driven economies, non-market economies, countries that pursue models of state-directed capitalism. Because of course, when most of the rules that we're operating under today were set, it was just taken as a given that all major trading nations would be market-driven economies. And no one ever could have conceived China. No one ever could have conceived that China would become what it has become today under a model of state-directed capitalism and a not fully market economy. So the rules as they are currently laid out cannot really adequately deal with these points of friction. Now, the problem that we've got is a lot of these problems are really intractable because when you've got a mixture of governmental action and private action and the lines between those two are blurred, it's immensely difficult to organize rules. If you appointed me as the dictator of the global trading system, and I could write any rule and every country in the world was required to follow it, I don't know if I could solve some of these problems in terms of the friction points between market and non-market economies. It's immensely difficult to unravel these things. So I think the issue of SOEs is a big one. I think it strikes people as on just a fundamental gut level that it's unfair if companies that enjoy substantial state backing, loan guarantees, preferential loans, a whole variety of of direct and indirect subsidies are competing with private companies, that is in fact fundamentally unfair in a number of respects. But how we can ever arrive at a mutually agreed set of rules to rein in those disciplines, it's not apparent to me that we can. So we'll see. I think this is one of the biggest challenges facing the global trading system, but the solution to it is not apparent to me, unfortunately.
There's a question to you, Stephen, which I think anybody from the panel, all from the panel could respond. There is, NTBs, non-tariff barriers, have been expanding continuously since ever the WTO was founded, and that is hampering exports in a big way. And how do you deal with that? You're not able to deal with that. Is there a way forward?
I think their transparency is critical, because I think where the non-tariff barriers really get nettlesome is when it's not really entirely clear how and what the bureaucrats are doing behind the border to surreptitiously disadvantage foreign products. So I think there the issue is just to push as hard as we can for greater visibility in what's taking place behind the border, because this darkness provides the cover that nefarious bureaucrats can use to disadvantage foreign products. But if we can't see exactly what's happening, there's no chance we have to address it.
I'll take over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Pradeep. And let me first of all thank all the participants. Frankly, as you began this discussion by saying that I'm not an expert on trade, and I mentioned that I really agreed to do this in order to learn. So I don't want to sort of make pronouncements, but let me make some very general comments on my kind of takeaway from the discussion. One, I think there's general agreement that we can take a lot of satisfaction that MC12 did not end in a failure. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it has been an outstanding success, but I think the fact that it did succeed in some areas and that it has kept the ball in play in other areas avoids the problem that would otherwise have happened, to say that is just signaling the end of the WTO. And I don't think anyone wants that. And therefore, to that extent, anyone interested in a sensible global trading arrangement would say that it's a good outcome that we should commend. But of course, there's a huge amount of work to be done in the areas that have been discussed. I made the point about, and maybe this is a purely Indian perception, multilateralism versus plurilateralism. I can fully see that if you have a plurilateral approach, let me step back. I think the move into plurilateral arrangements, originally was kind of accepted where you had neighboring countries with some kind of a geographical continuity. These countries would be giving each other benefits which would not be multilateralized in their external tariffs, and somehow we sort of accepted that. But of course, plurilateralism as it has evolved is not that. It's actually gone to the extent where, irrespective of geographical contiguity, groups of countries give each other a whole lot of benefits, which they don't extend to others. So those benefits are not multilateralized. You could interpret that as perfectly consistent with the spirit of multilateralism if this was an open plurilateral arrangement. That is to say, we have agreed on this, and any country that wants to accept all these obligations can get the benefits. Now, that would throw open the question that to countries that are hesitant about entering into such arrangements, they would have the choice of always getting in later, but at the cost of not being able to shape the nature of the agreement. So, huge benefit, in my view, to joining the agreement early and shaping it rather than staying out and then seeing whether we join later on. I mean, I think what happens on digital trade, etc., is a very, and e-commerce, very important areas. And I think certainly in India, we have to look at, how do we approach it? Because I think we've been a bit ambivalent in this area. So that's an important question. This gets a little bit more complicated if you take what US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said about friend shoring. Now, friend shoring is a kind of a unique kind of plurilateralism. That is, it's a plurilateralism that's going to be restricted to what are called friends and exclude countries that are not called friends. But you know how reasonable that is if it's purely kind of geopolitical, that's one thing. If, on the other hand, it's based on the belief of non-transparency arising from the non-market nature of the economies, prevalence of SOEs, etc., that's another thing. And we need to think about that. I mean, I think Stephen said that he didn't quite know how this was going to sort out, and I don't either. But my point really was that looking at it purely from an Indian sort of perspective, I'm hopeful that we will have progress on dispute settlement. I'm hopeful that the WTO, as we know it now, will continue, and maybe it will improve in certain dimensions. But I suspect that deeper integration of trade amongst trading partners will be dependent on what you might call greater alignment of behind the border arrangements, which traditionally many countries, including India, have not approved of. So we have to think about if that's the option available, do we stay out? Or do we say accept the fact that there has to be some alignment and join in? Now, that's not a WTO issue. That's an Indian policy, trade policy issue. And we have to think about how to proceed. But all of this will be confidence in the international trading system will be hugely increased if we have a functioning WTO, which most people see as a rule-based system with some scope for dispute resolution. So I do agree that resurrecting the dispute resolution mechanism is absolutely crucial. I also think that if you look ahead, we have to address two issues. One is I see no justification whatsoever, and I have no idea, by the way, what is the government of India's position. I'm just giving you my own view as an economist. I see no justification whatsoever for treating the SDR arrangements, special and differential responsibility arrangements, to be triggered by a pure self-certification on whether you're a developing country. I mean, quite honestly, it makes no sense at all. So there's no reason why we shouldn't say, well, look, we do believe in this, and this is the trigger. Maybe the trigger is per capita GDP or some such thing. Have a trigger and let countries know that the moment you cross that, which every sensible country would want to cross, you just lose the special and differential treatment benefit. I mean, I cannot see any defense of that position. That's clearly, that's sort of my view, really. I would also go further and say that, if you want a functioning global trading system, this notion of consensus, and nobody's quite, I think Pascal Lamy frequently says consensus doesn't mean agreement by everybody, but I'm not really sure what the current legal interpretation is. But many people interpret it that you can't move forward if a single country votes no. And that doesn't make any sense at all. So I really don't see why WTO shouldn't accept something like a weighted voting system, where periodically you declare the trade share. Every 5 years, you declare the trade share of each country. And basically, you have a qualifying majority, not just 50%. You set a reasonably high qualifying majority rule. And you create a situation where if countries accounting for 95% of the trade agree, you can make it 97.5 if you want to avoid the odd holdout problem. I don't see why we shouldn't move to such a system. So that's controversial. I don't know what the trade experts think. And I know that many of the people who work with and on WTO regard the consensus rule in the WTO as absolutely sacrosanct and something that distinguishes it from the Bretton Woods institutions, which are all kind of weighted voting. But at the same time, the Bretton Woods institutions, for whatever is worth, are more easily able to decide things. And as we get into some of these complex areas, I can't help feeling that a shift to a qualified majority rule would make the WTO a lot more functionally efficient. Well, those are quick reactions, and I'm waiting to see the written record and chat with Pradeep to see whether I should modify my own views. But I mean, I'd be very happy if somebody wants to disagree with what I've said, just to set my thinking straight. So each of you have 1 minute. Whoever wants to use their minutes, please pitch in.
Hamid.
Thank you. Exactly 1 minute. I think the consensus question is terribly important, and here it is a hurdle, but I would actually suggest that the problem is not with the consensus rule per se, but with how it's being abused and how consensus is being required where there is no legal requirement for a consensus. The treaty says consensus is the way of decision making, but there are so many things that don't need consensus at all. So the problem is with how it is used more than the consensus as a concept. One thing about the mechanisms for applying special and differential treatment and differentiated responsibilities, I think, as I was saying, this increasing diversity in membership, in looking at WTO reform, we should look at how do we introduce more variable geometry in how agreements apply and how obligations are being undertaken in order to allow for customized negotiated outcomes. Trade facilitation agreement is a good example, but we need more than that, because in the trade facilitation agreement, flexibility is only with respect to the implementation, but at the end, everybody ends up exactly with the same level of obligation. There is a different model in the GATS, in the services agreement, where the substance of obligations is variable, the variable geometry in undertaking commitments. Now that is about how you design the treaty with the kind of variable geometry that allows customization of negotiated outcomes. That can be unpacked. I mean, you would need a separate webinar for that, Pradeep. But the last thing I would say here is that a lot of the problems that we're facing now can be resolved not through new rules. Of course, we need new rules, but there are problems that can be resolved by clarifying existing rules. There's Article 9 of the WTO agreement, which says that members have the exclusive authority to issue authoritative interpretations, interpret existing rules. It hasn't been used once in the life of the WTO. And there is a lot of room for clarifying existing rules in order to ease the way forward. And thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Victor.
Yes, thanks, Pradeep, and thanks, Montek. Hamid has made my comments easier. I just want to stress this. The WTO toolbox already has different tools that allow for differentiation of commitments and obligations. Yes, consensus is there. I spent the last 10 years of my life as director of the council before I retired, dealing with the consensus rule. The consensus rule is incredibly complex, tricky, and as you said it yourself, Montek, it could have been improved, and it means different things to different people. But one thing is for sure, we don't need consensus of 164. Most of the people would stay silent, but you do need consensus of a certain group of countries that will not oppose an agreement and that would use the consensus rule in a responsible manner. So when Pascal says it should be justified, I think he has in mind what went on, and Hamid remembers this, in the GATT times. In the GATT times, the collective membership or the contracting parties would try to address the problem of one member who was not being able to join the consensus at some point in time. What you're seeing today is people saying, I won't join the consensus because I don't like it, without any explanation, without giving a trade reason for this. This is unacceptable. This is irresponsible behavior. Let's say it how it is. And there has been quite a bit of that by big countries, and you know these countries, right? So let's think that maybe, as Hamid is saying, consensus is not the problem in and of itself. The problem may be how people are applying the consensus rule. I want to say just 1 minute about, one comment about state-owned enterprises, market economy. This is at the center of the problems in dispute settlement. Many WTO members are already arming themselves with measures to tackle the lack of dispute settlement. The European Union has done it, Brazil has done it, and this can quickly unravel if people start getting weapons to defend themselves outside the mechanism. So we're going through a dangerous path there that I would caution against. But again, it's not easy to solve, and everybody knows what this means. Everybody knows that unfair trade practices are there and that the systems are unfair. The relationship between the state and the productive sector in different countries works in different ways, and this is a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think we have two. So Stephen and then Simon.
Just a very, very brief comment, Montek, on your suggestion about maybe considering a weighted voting, and once something has the support of, say, 95% or 97% of the membership, it's approved. Really intriguing suggestion. I think something worth considering. The only thing I'd point out, though, that keep in mind is if you establish such a rule, then you are bequeathing a de facto veto power on a certain number of countries, depending on where you set that bar. I think both US and China are well above 10% of global trade. So you're sort of privileging a small number of countries by saying you are given a de facto veto, because if you withhold your support, you'll drop us below that threshold. But anyway, an intriguing suggestion worth thinking about, and thank you for making it.
Okay. I think Simon wanted to say something. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and also thank you, Montek, for your summary. There's a lot in it that I absolutely agree with, and would hope that would become the position of the government of India over time, but that's another story. Let me congratulate you on, and you and Pradeep, on organizing this series of events. It's very heartening to see that there are many people who want to see the WTO move forward. And in the spirit of that suggestion, I do hope that India gives thought to how it can use its G20 presidency to help build a new consensus on what could be principles for reforming the WTO. I must say, I'm not, having spoken with your relevant Commerce Ministry officials, the agenda at the moment doesn't seem to be very ambitious. And maybe it could become a little bit more ambitious, and Cuts and others could provide useful inputs into that process. I do think this is an opportunity that India has, and I hope it will grasp. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Pradeep, back to you.
Right. Well, we have now 5 minutes, except for me to propose a vote of thanks and also comment on a few things, particularly on India's position. An article which I wrote just after the holding of MC12 had highlighted the same fact as many of us said. Look, at least we've not backslided. which was itself a very big achievement. And that is something which sort of is a part of my philosophy of activism, as it were. That even if we can't achieve any progress, at least we should stop things from backsliding, and that is what has happened. And here I must admire the energy exhibited and the enthusiasm exhibited by Ngozi in pushing forward the agenda. My only problem in the run up to the MC12 was an unnecessary time and energy devoted to the TRIPS issue, when vaccine supply was going on without any particular problem. In fact, this ended up, as somebody's pointed out, even that there's a lot of vaccine which is lying unutilized. And having said that, we could not devote time, the international community or the community in Geneva, on very substantive issues which would have helped to enrich the MC12 much better than what it actually came about, except for the fact that there was still a lot of. Now, India did take a position. That is one reason why and I dare say that what my sources tell me is that the Prime Minister did instruct the Trade Minister that, look, we have to have a positive outcome. So the fact is that the government of India has been talking about buttressing or boosting multilateralism, and this has been seen as an important aspect of multilateralism, that we don't want to appear to be another spoil sport. And this is something which I think I must share with you. It is not a secret really, but it's still not well known that there's a very clear instruction to the Trade Minister from Delhi that, look, we need an outcome which is positive and not negative. So whatever you want to do, I mean, particularly one of the biggest problems which India has been talking about again and again is the issue of public stockholding, PSH, and that we still want a very clear agreement on that. That is still pending, and that is now shifted to MC13. Though the fact is that we do have a kind of a waiver or a safeguard against it being used, but we are worried that technically there is a problem. It's as it happened, our rice subsidies were challenged, and therefore we are not very sure whether this will stay that way or not. And therefore, this is one of the reasons why. Now, agriculture is certainly a very dirty area that we have seen happening all the time. I see Tim rejoining us. Agriculture has been one area, which is what I've often said in the past also, and we seem to forget the fact is that special and differential treatment in favor of the rich countries in the context of agriculture has been enforceable. And therefore, why is it that there is a grouse against the developing world, and it is the special and differential treatment, if any, is mainly on a best endeavor basis. Having said that, these are inequities in the system which need to be addressed and to go forward, and Keynes Group has been talking about it. With that, let me thank you all once again, and we hope to see you again as soon as we can at another platform or similar things. Some of the issues which are raised do require further discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Montek. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Stephen, Simon, Hamid, and in absentia, Annabelle, as well as Tim. Thank you very much.